This final problem with the media will probably be with us forever, at least on a small scale, because it's less about the industry than simple human nature. That problem is blind spots. Like everyone else, journalists have gaps in our knowledge. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know. Blind spots can be found at outlets of every scale and among journalists of every political persuasion. And in the move away from in-person newsrooms to a lot of remote work, as well as downsizing in many local media outlets in particular, that's only making this worse. When you have a good-sized staff of writers and editors working together in real time in the same room, bouncing ideas off each other, it's easier to notice blind spots before they show up in print. But if you have a local paper with only 4 staffers left, well, you have the knowledge base of just 4 people. It's safe to say things will be missed. Now, part of why I want to dwell on blind spots for a minute here is that ignorance of religion is a very common media blind spot in my observation. Christian religiosity is declining in America. And by that I mean not only actual professions of faith, but sort of a baseline cultural knowledge from exposure to Christian stories, holidays, rituals, that sort of thing. And that's true for journalists just like everyone else. You wouldn't have to be deliberately discriminating against Christians to wind up with a dozen journalists with no firsthand knowledge of Christianity. And that ignorance, particularly if it's an unrealized ignorance, will show up in the work. Just recently, I was reading a story in a very prominent outlet which described someone getting baptized at Andy Stanley's church in Georgia, this big evangelical congregation. And the story was very deeply researched, lots of careful details. And this baptism anecdote was just a small piece of it. But the way the writer phrased it suggested the baptism was the moment of salvation, which is not in line with that church's theology. This congregation is non-denominational, but with approximately Southern Baptist theology. So that's not what they believe about baptism and salvation. It sounded closer to Catholic doctrine, if anything, which is quite different on this issue. And that kind of mistake is not unusual. It's also not malicious. It's that they didn't know what they didn't know. And for religion stories and lots of other coverage areas, this problem is exacerbated, not just by overall staff cuts in journalism, and there are a lot of those. Newsroom jobs declined by 25% between 2008 and 2021 alone. But it's not just overall cuts, it's specifically cuts to beat reporting. Beat reporting, you'll recall, is basically reporting on just one thing and developing real subject matter expertise there. So you might be a city hall reporter or a foreign policy reporter or a religion reporter or what have you. Well, if you're an outlet losing staff overall, it's harder to justify keeping people in those specialized beats. So instead of having 5 reporters who cover different aspects of city government, like education, the budget, the mayor, the town council, and public works, now you have just one city reporter who has to do a little bit of everything and doesn't have time to build up that detailed knowledge on anything. And you can see why this shift makes sense if you're trying to keep the lights on and cover the biggest stories, because that's better than covering nothing at all. But you can also see how it would severely exacerbate blind spots. And with faith in particular, the blind spot lands at an intersection of a very important topic, but also one with rapidly rising ignorance among generalist reporters.